In a dusty Texas shooting range far from the noise of the city, an old man arrives each morning before anyone else. He says little, fires 30 perfect rounds, then disappears. Most overlook him until a sharp-eyed trainee spots something on his arm that unravels a story no one expected. Before we begin today's journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Every morning, before the sun rose high enough to warm the Texas gravel, he was already there. The old man arrived in the same faded blue pickup, parking it in the far corner of the lot like he was trying not to disturb anyone. He moved slowly, but not weakly, each step deliberate, measured, like he'd walked this path 1,000 times. His name, no one really knew. The staff had him signed in as E. Monroe, but the regulars simply called him Old Eli. He wore the same thing every visit, a tan flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled just above the forearms, weathered jeans with faint grease stains, and a ball cap that might have once been navy but now had no color or symbol left. No patches, no military slogans, just shade over tired eyes. He didn't wear tactical gloves or flashy gear like the younger guys. His boots were scuffed but clean, and he carried only a small black range bag always in his right hand, never slung over the shoulder. Eli never greeted anyone with more than a slight nod. He signed the clipboard with a slow scrawl, last name only, and walked to the same spot, lane 9, the one furthest from the building. It was the quietest, the one that caught less echo from the Bluetooth speakers and idle talk at the front. No one had to ask why he picked it. It felt right, secluded, forgotten, like him. He never brought more than he needed. One pistol, one box of 30, 45 caliber rounds, one dented thermos of black coffee, and he never stayed longer than it took to fire exactly those 30 shots. No double taps, no drills, just slow, precise shooting, 3 rounds. Pause, 2 more, then silence. To most of the younger shooters, he was just background noise, a relic. They joked that he must have been a retired trucker with too much time and not enough hobbies. They glance over and laugh quietly about how the old guy still thinks it's 1975 and go back to their group selfies and ammo comparisons. But something about the way he stood started to catch the attention of one of them, Derek, a SEAL trainee on weekend leave. Derek didn't laugh with the others. Not anymore. He watched Eli's grip textbook, his stance balanced, grounded. The rhythm of his shooting, methodical, almost ceremonial. It wasn't just good, it was disciplined, like muscle memory built on something deeper than training. And for the first time, Derek began to wonder who exactly was this quiet old man standing alone at the edge of the range, acting like he didn't belong when maybe, just maybe, he belonged there more than any of them ever would. Derek had seen shooters with sharp aim before. He'd trained under elite instructors and stood beside men whose reflexes could shame a stopwatch. But there was something different about Elias Monroe, something that went beyond muscle memory or perfect trigger control. It was in the stillness between each shot, the subtle recalibration of posture, the almost imperceptible way he listened to the silence around him. Derek couldn't explain it yet, but he knew it was real. That morning, the sunlight cut through the thin fog rising off the gravel lot. Derek was 2 lanes over from Elias, going through slow drills on his Glock. His friend's other trainees, cocky and loud, were competing over groupings and trash talk. But Derek couldn't stop glancing sideways. Eli's shooting rhythm had a hypnotic precision. 3 shots. Pause. 2 more. Always in a tight cluster. Always within the bullseye. There was no flash, no speed, just quiet devastation. As Elias reloaded, his sleeve shifted slightly with the motion, and that's when Derek saw it, just a flicker of ink on the forearm. He blinked, then looked again. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't trendy or tribal. It was something else entirely, a faded symbol with 2 numbers below it. A symbol Derek had only seen once before, in a training slideshow about historical units that never existed on paper. His heart skipped. The design was barely visible under the weathered skin, dulled by sun and time, but it was clear enough for anyone who knew what to look for. And Derek knew. It was the emblem of a recon unit that operated deep in Southeast Asia during the war, unofficially, unrecorded. It wasn't something you got at a tattoo shop. It was earned in the jungle, in blood. He stood frozen for a moment, struggling between curiosity and respect. Then, moving slowly, he stepped closer. Eli had just inserted his magazine and was checking his sight alignment when Derek spoke. "Sir," he said, voice low but firm, "that ink, is that Recon Delta?" Elias didn't turn immediately. He finished aligning his stance, fired 2 more shots, then gently set the pistol down. He finally looked over, his eyes steady and unreadable. For a long second, he said nothing. Then, in a voice that carried decades of dust and silence, he answered, 69. Mekong Delta. That was it. 3 words. No elaboration. No bravado. But it was enough. The words hit Derek harder than he expected. Around them, the noise of the range seemed to dull, like the rest of the world had faded a notch. His friends, still joking a few lanes down, hadn't heard. But a couple of other staff, older guys, had noticed Derek's sudden change in posture. They began to glance over. Derek nodded once, stepped back, and returned to his lane. But his hands didn't move the same way anymore. His breathing felt heavier. The plastic and steel in his grip no longer just felt like a firearm. It felt like a responsibility. Because beside him stood a man who had walked through a war most people only saw in documentaries. And he wasn't giving speeches. He wasn't correcting stances. He was just there. The moment lingered in Derek's mind for the rest of the session. As Elias continued shooting with his steady tempo, Derek couldn't shake the weight of that tattoo. He'd seen posers before, young guys with flashy ink and fabricated stories. But this was different. There was history under that sleeve, the kind that didn't need to be explained. When Elias packed up 30 rounds fired, not one wasted, he moved like a man completing a ritual. He cleaned his pistol with care, wiped the bench with a folded cloth, then stood slowly. No limp, no stiffness, just gravity. Respected. Derek stood again as he passed. "Sir," he said softly, "thank you for—" Elias stopped him with just a glance. It wasn't unkind, but it was firm, as if to say, "Not here, not now." Then he gave a nod, slightly longer than before. Derek watched as the old man disappeared down the gravel path, thermos under his arm. He didn't need confirmation. He knew exactly what that tattoo meant, and more importantly, what it cost. From that moment, Derek's perspective shifted. He started watching the others differently. The way they laughed, the way they dismissed the quiet, the way they assumed respect had to be demanded instead of earned. He saw how often they overlooked the man who had stood beside them for months, who had taught more in silence than some instructors taught in a year. Later that evening, as the sky turned a soft amber, Derek looked up the symbol again, just to be sure. It took time, deep in restricted records and forgotten footnotes. But there it was, Recon Delta Unit, unofficial operations, Mekong River Theater, 1969, listed under classified engagements, not subject to publication. One note stood out: only awarded to operatives embedded under radio silence for extended periods. No media, no citation. That tattoo wasn't pride, it was burden, and the man who wore it wasn't seeking recognition. He was simply honoring a promise to stay silent until someone wise enough asked the right question. Derek had returned to his lane that day with his pulse steady, but his mind racing. The weight of Elias's silence was heavier than words, heavier than any lesson he'd received in months of SEAL training. That kind of silence didn't come from pride. It came from memory, from the kind of past that didn't need to be retold to be respected. After the final shots echoed through the dusty air, the range slowly returned to its usual hum. But something had shifted. Derek finished cleaning his weapon, barely listening to the chatter of his teammates. When he turned, Elias was zipping up his worn range bag, the thermos tucked beneath his arm like always. Derek hesitated, then stepped forward again, more cautiously this time. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "if you don't mind me asking, when did you serve?" Elias didn't speak right away. He locked the slide on his pistol, wiped it down once more, and then finally looked up. 69 to 75, he replied. Recon. Southeast Asia. That confirmed everything. It wasn't just the ink. It was the posture, the precision, the silence. This wasn't some war story handed down or dressed up. This was the real thing. The kind of man who didn't talk because he didn't need to. Derek swallowed hard. "Did you ever train with SEALs?" Elias let the faintest smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Back then, we all trained with whoever survived long enough to teach." That was the last thing he said before slinging the bag over his shoulder. He turned to leave. But halfway down the gravel path, he stopped. Without looking back, he reached into his pocket and walked back toward Derek. The younger man stood at attention not because it was protocol, but because it felt right. Elias stepped in close and placed something in Derek's palm. A coin, heavy, cold. One side bore the insignia Derek had seen on the old man's arm. The other carried two words, deeply etched, still standing. Elias leaned in, voice low, almost a whisper. "You'll know when it's time to go quiet," he said. "Until then, earn it." Then he walked away. Derek stood there for a long moment, staring at the coin, feeling its weight not just in his hand, but in his chest, around him. The others were packing up, laughing, tossing brass like poker chips. None of them saw it happen. None of them heard what was said, but somehow they sensed a change. One by one, they quieted. That night, Derek couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, the coin resting on his desk under a small lamp, catching a faint glint in the dark. It didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a challenge, like a reminder that greatness didn't announce itself. It waited. He sat up around midnight and powered on his laptop. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, just something to validate what his instincts already knew. Hours passed as he scoured forums, declassified archives, military history blogs. Most of it was noise, redacted files, ghost names. But he kept digging. Finally, buried deep in an obscure Mac VSOG after action report, he found it. March 1971. Operation Raven, Mekong Delta. Extraction under fire. 7 recovered. 1 operator refused medevac. Wounded twice. Declined award recommendation. Entry sealed by request. Sergeant E. Monroe. That was it. No headline. No medal. Just one line that survived decades of silence. A whisper between bureaucratic sheets of history. Derek leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He reread the line 5 times. The words "refused medevac" echoed in his mind. The idea of staying behind, not for glory, not for story, but because the mission came first, landed like a punch. That explained everything. The silence, the eyes, the 30 rounds. Elias Monroe wasn't a legend because someone said he was. He was a legend because no one ever had to. The next morning, Derek returned to the range earlier than usual. He placed the coin carefully in the small pocket of his range bag, zipped it shut, and sat quietly near lane 9, waiting. He wasn't sure what he expected. A lesson, maybe, a conversation. But when Elias finally arrived, walking that same steady path across the gravel, he didn't look at Derek or acknowledge the coin. He simply nodded, like nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. The next time Elias returned to the range, Derek was already there waiting at the far end of the parking lot, standing beside lane 9. He hadn't told the others what to do, hadn't sent a message or given a speech, but somehow, without words, a few of his fellow trainees showed up early too. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was guilt, or maybe they just wanted to be close enough to the silence to understand it better. Elias stepped out of his pickup with the same steady movements as always. Same boots, Same range bag, same expressionless calm. But something had changed. Not in him, but in the space around him. The air felt quieter. Not because the gunfire had stopped, but because the laughter and swagger had. He walked past the group of young men without a glance, and they, in turn, didn't interrupt him. They stood straighter, shoulders squared, eyes forward. A few gave small nods as he passed. Nothing loud or performative, just a gesture of respect earned the old-fashioned way. At lane 9, Elias set down his gear with the same deliberate rhythm. Bag, thermos, target sheet, no wasted movement. He pinned up the target, adjusted his stance, and prepared to shoot. Then Derek stepped forward, holding something out in both hands. It was a fresh, sealed box of .45 caliber rounds. Elias looked down at it, then at Derek. The younger man didn't smile. He didn't joke. He simply said, "I figured 30 wasn't enough today. Sir?" There was a long pause. Elias gave a nod, not brief this time, but full, with weight behind it. Then he accepted the box without a word and returned to his lane. The first shot cracked through the air a few seconds later, followed by another and another. Same rhythm, same grouping, but this time, something about it echoed louder. The range staff noticed it too. The way the other lanes had slowed, just a bit. The way conversations were quieter, more deliberate. It wasn't fear, it was focus. Respect, unspoken. As Elias worked through the first magazine, the young men kept their distance, but they watched carefully. No longer for curiosity or mockery, but to learn. Every movement of Elias's hands, every pause between reloads, every breath carried more meaning than any lecture they'd ever heard. Later, as the sun climbed and the brass scattered across the floor, Elias finished his final grouping and stepped back. He sat on the bench near the wall and took a sip from his dented thermos. One by one, the younger men approached, not as a group, not in formation, but individually. A nod here, a handshake there. A quiet sir offered with sincerity. Even Petty, the loudest and youngest among them, lingered a moment longer. His eyes dropped slightly when he spoke. "We looked you up," he said. "Some of us. I mean, you saved a lot of people, sir." Elias didn't blink. He wiped the rim of his thermos with a frayed sleeve and replied calmly, "They saved each other." Petty looked like he wanted to say something more, but then he simply nodded and stepped away. The last to approach was Derek. He didn't speak right away. He sat beside Elias on the bench, both men staring out toward the far targets, most of them now torn and curling from the wind. "Finally," Derek said. "You ever think about teaching Elias?" Let the steam from the thermos swirl around his face before answering. "I spent 30 years trying to forget everything I'd teach." Derek considered that in silence, then nodded slowly. "Some of us need to remember it." Elias didn't answer at first. He took another sip, his eyes still on the targets. Then he turned slightly, voice low. "You don't teach this," he said. "You absorb it." Derek exhaled. "That's why I'm still listening." Elias gave him a long look, longer than any before, and then stood without a word. He packed his pistol with methodical care, zipped his range bag halfway, and turned to leave. But as he did, he left the box of unused rounds sitting on the bench beside Derek, unopened, untouched. A small gesture, but it said everything. That afternoon, after the crowd had cleared, the staff at the range made a quiet decision. No meeting, no announcement, just a small brass plate, no larger than a business card, screwed into the wood above lane 9. It didn't say hero. It didn't say recon. It didn't even say veteran. It simply read reserved until he says otherwise. Elias never asked who put it there, and he never told them to take it down. The brass plate above lane 9 remained untouched. No one dared question it, and no one ever sat there without seeing Elias arrive first. It wasn't policy, it was respect. Unwritten, yet deeply understood. And from that day forward, the young men at the range began watching differently. Not just Elias, but each other. Their rhythm changed, their tones softened, and their egos dimmed. Elias never addressed the shift. He didn't need to. He showed up exactly as he always had early, quiet, methodical. But now, every small movement he made became a lesson. Not because he intended it that way, but because those around him had learned how to see. He would line up his pistol with careful control, adjust his stance without fuss, and fire 3 rounds. Pause, then 2. Always the same pattern. Always tight, clean groupings. Every shot followed the same calm, almost meditative routine. There was no rush, no celebration after a perfect cluster, only stillness and the familiar sound of brass hitting the concrete floor. Derek began to understand what it meant to absorb a lesson rather than receive one. He often found himself sitting nearby on the bench, not to talk, but to watch. He brought fewer words with him now, fewer jokes, more questions, though most of them stayed in his head. He watched the way Elias reloaded, smooth, confident, with a kind of reverence. He noticed the way the older man always scanned his surroundings, even in a familiar space. The way he never faced away from the door, the way he never flinched, even when a shot cracked unexpectedly from the next lane over. These weren't habits. They were echoes, traces of a life once lived on a razor's edge. One morning, Derek finally broke the silence. "You always shoot 30, he said. Never more, never less." Elias didn't stop loading his magazine. "That's all I needed," he replied. "1 box, 1 hour, keeps my hands honest." Derek nodded, but something about that answer stuck with him. He realized then that every action Elias took was precise, not just in motion, but in purpose. Nothing wasted, not even time. Later that week, one of the younger men, Petty, stayed after hours. He waited by the bench with a hesitant posture, clutching his range log in one hand. When Elias walked by, Petty spoke up, voice awkward but sincere. "Sir, I've been trying to improve my grouping. I noticed how tight yours always are. Would you mind?" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. Elias didn't respond immediately. He looked at the paper in Petty's hand, then at the boy's posture. Petty's stance was sloppy, shoulders too high, grip uneven, but his eyes were focused, honest. Without a word, Elias stepped forward, placed a hand on Petty's wrist, and adjusted his grip. Then he tapped his elbow, shifted his weight slightly, and stepped back. "Try now," he said. Petty fired. The shots landed closer together than they had all week. He turned, wide-eyed. "Thank you, sir." Elias gave only a small nod and walked away. Word began to spread not through gossip, but through behavior. The recruits started watching not just Elias, but each other. They offered quiet corrections instead of taunts. They cleaned their stations more thoroughly. They began arriving early, sometimes sitting in the silence before the first shot rang out. One morning, after a long training session, Derek asked Elias again, "You really never thought about teaching?" Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed, thermos in hand. "I've taught more by standing still than I ever could with a whiteboard," he said. Derek chuckled. Some of us still want to hear it. The stories, the real stuff. Elias looked over at him, not unkindly. The ones who need the stories aren't ready. The ones who are ready don't need them told. And just like that, the conversation ended. There was no speech, no ceremony, no appointed role. But over the weeks, Elias became something none of them had expected: a standard, a compass, a quiet presence that reminded them who they were trying to become. He never once raised his voice, never demanded anything. But when he stood behind you and watched your form, you felt it. And when he nodded, even slightly, you knew you'd done something right. The lessons weren't about shooting. Not really. They were about posture, discipline, presence, respect. And as the weeks passed, the coin Derek kept in his bag began to feel less like a relic and more like a reminder. Watch, listen, absorb, because some men teach without words, and the ones worth learning from rarely need to speak at all. The lessons had sunk in quietly, like water through stone. No fanfare, no lectures, just a shift in how they stood, how they breathed, how they treated each trigger pull like a responsibility rather than a contest. Elias hadn't spoken much, but Lane 9 had become his classroom, and every spent casing was part of the syllabus. The brass plaque above Lane 9 was still there, no larger than a business card, no brighter than the wood it was screwed into. Reserved until he says otherwise. It didn't need a name. Everyone knew who it referred to, and more importantly, no one dared challenge it. Elias arrived just as he always had. Same time, same walk. Same battered thermos swinging under his arm. He never acknowledged the plaque, not even with a glance, but he didn't ignore it either. He simply walked to Lane 9 as if it had always belonged to him. No one ever arrived earlier to claim the lane. Even on busy weekends when the line stretched out the door, Lane 9 sat quietly untouched until Elias stepped onto the gravel. The staff didn't explain it to new customers. They didn't need to. People picked up on it quick. And if someone asked, they got the same answer every time that lane's taken. Don't ask by who. There was no ceremony surrounding him, no crowd gathering to take photos or shake hands. But there was reverence, an unspoken understanding among the younger men that this man, this quiet old figure in worn flannel, had done more, seen more, and endured more than they could ever guess. Derek still came often, though less to train now and more to observe. He no longer felt the need to compete or prove himself with tight groupings. Instead, he focused on his composure, on his awareness. He adjusted his stance less frequently, moved with greater intention, and reloaded without theatrics. His rhythm had slowed not from hesitation, but from purpose. One morning, as Elias packed up after another clean run of 30 perfect shots, he paused longer than usual. Derek noticed it how Elias stood at the edge of the lane, eyes drifting toward the far tree line. His hand lingered over the thermos, but he didn't lift it right away. Derek approached with a quiet step. Everything all right. Sir Elias didn't look at him at first. He simply said, "You know what the hardest part is?" Derek waited. "Not forgetting," Elias said finally. "It's carrying it without making others carry it too." The words weren't bitter. They were tired. Perhaps honest. He turned then, met Derek's eyes, and added, "You'll learn that someday. If you're lucky." Derek didn't reply. He knew there was nothing to say. Later that day, Elias didn't leave right away. Instead of walking straight to his truck, he sat on the bench near the front wall. A few of the younger shooters passed by and offered quiet nods or a soft, "Sir." Elias returned each one with a glance. Sometimes a small nod. Never a word. It was all they needed. Petty, now more serious than ever, approached last. He carried a worn notebook, his training journal, and handed it to Elias without a word. Elias flipped through it slowly, then handed it back. "You're thinking more than you shoot," he said. Petty looked nervous. "Is that bad?" Elias shook his head. "It means you're finally learning." Weeks passed. The plaque stayed. Elias came and went, his rituals unchanged. But one morning, he didn't arrive. It was the first time in over a year. The staff didn't panic. They figured maybe he was ill. Maybe he had a doctor's appointment. But as the days stretched into 2 weeks, the absence became something heavier. Derek waited each morning by Lane 9, just in case. He didn't ask questions. He just waited. Then, on a crisp Thursday morning, a white envelope appeared on the counter. No return address. Inside was a single card, handwritten in deliberate script. "The lane is yours now. Use it well. E.M." It wasn't signed formally. No rank, no date, just a hand that had carried more than ink. And beneath the card, tucked gently inside the envelope, was the coin, the same one Derek had once received, the one that said still standing. The next morning, Derek didn't take lane 9. He let it stay empty, untouched. As the sun rose over the gravel, some men leave quietly, and some leave behind a silence so full, it echoes louder than words ever could.